But what you all really want to know about is what's going on with the Republican Party. And this is, I'm going to both look at that on a small level, but then I'm going to get bigger and bigger because it certainly appears as though the Republican Party is crumbling. And that has a lot of different pieces to it. So, somebody has said, how frustrating it is that we've been saying now for a decade, and for what it's worth, I've been talking about it for like 30 years, that the Republican Party cannot continue the way it is, and yet here it still is. That's a fair criticism, I think. And what people like me do is we try to read the tea leaves and say this is what things look like, and tell you what our evidence is, and you can disagree with it. So, one of the things that you have seen, and a lot of you wrote in your questions lately, is the statement that a number of Republican members of Congress are thinking about resigning or retiring, not running again in 2026. And you asked me who they were and whether what that was going to be true. I don't know. That's in the future. And I can't predict the future for you. I can tell you that if they are leaking that to journalists, as they obviously are, they're very, very unhappy. And you saw a glimmer of that with Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Republican of Georgia, who announced that she is going to be resigning from Congress. I believe it's on January 5th, 2026, 3 days after she secures her pension, just FYI on that one. Um, but when she wrote a quite a long, it was a 4-page letter about why she felt that she was going to resign. And it was a really interesting letter. Now, I just want to get out ahead of the fact that I expect to see in all these comments, you can't trust her and, we don't like her and all that. 100%. I mean, the one thing that's really interesting about Greene is that she is a fairly astute political observer, and she goes where the prevailing winds are. That doesn't mean you have to like her. That doesn't mean you have to vote for her. That doesn't mean you have to believe anything she says. It does mean that it's worth listening to what she says because she has a good sense of where the people are on the ground. So she wrote this long letter, and you can get copies of it. It's on the internet. It's also on social media. But I'll lay out for you what's in it. She laid out in great detail how frustrated she was that people like her, and mind you, again, this is incredibly self-serving, right? Who's her audience? What's she doing? And you always think those things through, but that people like her who are trying to work for everyday Americans, and she calls them common Americans, although I don't recall off the top of my head, can't get traction in Congress because of both parties that are working against her. Put a pin in that, because I'm going to come back to it in just a minute. Then she goes on to say that she doesn't want to be primaried by Trump and have him spend tens of millions of dollars to primary her, that is, to run somebody who is more pro-Trump even than her, to the right of her, only to, as she says, win the seat. Because she's not going to say, I think I'll lose. She said, I will win the seat, but then the Republicans are going to lose the majority in 2026. This is her talking, not me. And then we're going to have to defend the president against impeachment. And after he's just spent tens of millions of dollars to destroy me. So in that, I think you can read a lot of things. First of all, lots of people are saying that the Republicans are going to lose the majority in 2026. And there's every sign that that's the case. Again, put a pin in that one because I'm going to come back to it. But there is also her talking about impeachment, which one has to expect the House will move forward on if the Democrats have a majority, because to get articles of impeachment through the House, you only need a simple majority. To get them through, to get a conviction in the Senate, you need a lot more votes than that. So, but that's not necessarily out of reach. I'll come back to that too. So she is essentially saying if the Democrats get the majority, we can expect that there will be an impeachment. Now, why would you impeach somebody if you knew they weren't going to be convicted? In part because you have hearings. The American people get to see what this person has done. and decide whether or not they think it's bad. And in the case of Trump, I think we already know from his plummeting poll numbers. There were two polls came out today that had him at 35%. Now those are outliers on the negative side, but even still, he is down under 40% on average. Um, we know that people don't like what he's doing. And we also know that the more stuff that comes out, the worse this administration looks. So it is not a huge leap to suggest that she's right when she says that we might well see impeachment if the Democrats get a majority in the next Congress. But more interesting than that is, and that certainly is why a lot of Republicans are talking about resigning or not running again or whatever, is partly because it's no fun to be in the minority. You can't really do very much. And also because of the leadership, as it is, of Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who is a Republican from Louisiana, who simply has been refusing to put forward anything, even that members of his own conference. I always get confused. The Democrats have a caucus, the Republicans have a conference. Even things that members of his own conference want, because he is doing Trump's bidding. He is very much doing Trump's bidding. And so a lot of those Republicans are like, I want to get out of here. I can't do anything. My constituents yell at me all the time because I'm trying to do stuff for them. Again, even Republicans are usually trying to do things that their members of their districts want. And I can't do anything because Mike Johnson keeps shutting me down. What's the point of this? I might as well be spending my time either doing what I want or running for a different sort of office. So you're actually seeing people focusing on going back to their states and working in their states. So that's that part of Marjorie Taylor Greene's letter was really interesting. But to my mind, more interesting is something that she articulated in that letter, or at least alluded to in that letter. It's not a terribly well written letter, but that I'm seeing in a lot of other places. And that was two things. First of all, her emphasis on, I forget what she calls it, not a uniparty, but the idea that both the leadership of both the Republicans and the Democrats are not working for the common people. And also the idea that she is working for the common people. And she said, when the American public figures this out, I will be here for them. To my mind, that sounds like she's making a bid for power that does not involve MAGA, that she is looking at what seems to be the collapse of MAGA. I'll talk more about that in a second. And she is taking a chance on staking out a different kind of future by riding what seems to be a new kind of, well, it's an old kind of political wave, but for this moment, a new kind of political wave into the future. And that is a focus on the economic issues that the majority of Americans are now quite focusing on because of the degree to which the Republican Party has not been answering their needs. So the collapse of the Republican Party, or the crumbling of the Republican Party, looks to me very much like the crumbling of the Republican Party in the 1890s, or of the Whig Party and the Democratic Party in the 1850s. We lose the Northern Democrats almost across the board in 1855 and 1856, after it becomes clear that the majority of the Democratic Party is siding with the elite Southern enslavers, which a lot of Northerners don't care about. They don't care about Black rights. They don't care about human enslavement. But what they don't want is the government to be beholden to a very few, very rich people. And when that happens, Northerners vote Democrats out of office in droves in the elections of 1855 and 1856. And this actually, I'm going to play this out a little bit before I go to the late 19th century. It's worth thinking about what that means. If the districts that are kind of what we would call purple districts are really mad enough, they get rid of the people that they think are working for the very wealthy. Or a group that people don't like. But the place that remains in the hands of those people tend to be, I've lost the plural of the verb at this point. they tend to be quite extreme districts. So what happened in 1855, 1856 in the Northern Democrats is that the moderate districts all just threw out their Democrats and turned to the rising Republican Party, but the extremist districts went more extreme than ever. So this is how you're going to end up during the Civil War with mostly war Democrats in the North, and that's a really broad brush. But the Democrats who remain in the North, like Clement Vallandigham, for example, those of you from Ohio probably have heard of him. Or if you were in eighth grade and had to read that story, The Man Without a Country, that was about Clement Vallandigham, which again, someday I'll tell you more about Clement Vallandigham, who died in a very interesting way. But he was really extreme. And Sunset Cox, another Ohio guy, Samuel S. Cox, known as Sunset, they were much more, they were kind of out of step with the rest of the North because they were in these extreme districts. And this is how you're going to get the idea of the Copperheads in the North. And they get their name from the fact that somebody tried to mail a couple of copperhead snakes to Lincoln, and the package breaks open, and but they become known as sort of the enemy within, if you will, the Copperheads. Anyway, that's worth paying attention to, because I think we're going to see the same thing, or we are seeing the same thing in this moment, where the districts that are frustrated with MAGA will stop electing MAGA and will turn to other candidates, and they're not necessarily Democratic candidates, but other candidates. And they will, so you'll end up with a much more homogeneous group of lawmakers in those districts. But the ones that are, Republican plus 17 will double down on real extreme people, and that's going to be very problematic. All right, so what is going on with, if I am identifying this uneasiness among elected lawmakers in the Republican Party right now, what is the larger story of the Republican Party and why it's in trouble right now? And honestly, I just think this is so fascinating. And I'm sorry when I do that. Remember, this is what I study, so it is intellectually interesting to me. Living through it isn't great, I gotta say, but intellectually, think about what's going on here. You have had in the Republican Party since the 1980s, and really taking off in the 1990s, a fairly uneasy marriage between at the time, establishment Republicans who wanted the government to work to concentrate wealth among a very few people. And there was an ideological argument behind that, but they want to slash the safety net, the social safety net, and they hate the Affordable Care Act. They want to get rid of social welfare programs and so on. They managed to stick together with the extremist, traditionalist religious people, the traditionalist evangelicals, especially white evangelicals, with racists, with sexists, with those sort of cultural extremes. And they managed to convince a lot of Americans that the reason things weren't going well for them was because of the Democrats, because the Democrats, in their parlance, in what they said, was that the Democrats were taking tax dollars and wasting them on people of color, on women who wanted abortions, on waste, fraud, and abuse. That they were really taking tax dollars and throwing them away, basically. And that rhetoric was really powerful. And it was really powerful, not least because the radical right managed to put together a group of media figures, especially on talk radio, but then the Fox News channel and other channels as well, really, really push that narrative. So if you listen to, for example, Rush Limbaugh, and he would talk about feminazis and, this whole idea that women who wanted equal pay for equal work were somehow associated with Nazism. I mean, it's really extreme stuff. And it got more and more extreme as the economy for ordinary Americans got worse and worse. So they were able to do that, and they were able to get away from that, and get away with that and continue to win elections based on that, especially when voter suppression began to kick in after 1998 in places like Florida. But the thing that's happened under the Trump administration, that was really falling apart by 2016, when, if you remember, and most people have memory hold this. But in 2016, Trump was really appeared to be the most moderate economically the most moderate Republican running for the presidency. He talked about fairer taxes. He talked about, you know, fixing healthcare. He talked about all these wonderful things he was going to do for ordinary Americans. Now, of course, he didn't do any of it. But if you listen to the way he talked, he sounded like he was going to try and fix this system for ordinary Americans. Now, and then he gets in office, and I'm not going to go through the whole first term because I want to get to the second term. But one of the things that's happened during the second term is the ability of the Project 2025 to put its wish list into effect. And it's an extremist wish list. Getting rid of US aid, for example, the things that they have done, the cuts that the Department of Government Efficiency made early on in the administration, what it did, I think, is that it stripped away the cover over that rhetoric. It was always rhetoric. I mean, the since 1980, I keep saying this, more than $50 trillion has moved from the bottom 50% of Americans to the top 1% of Americans. And that was the case because of supply side economics, which is what the Republicans put in place in the 1980s, and really kept pushing, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And the Democrats sort of went along with it because they sort of figured they had to work within these confines when people kept screaming about taxes. You can argue about whether or not that was the right decision, but it was sort of the way people thought about the government right then, and that's what they did. Um, but but under Trump in the second term, and first of all, Joe Biden comes in 2021, and he completely turns that on his head. He gets rid of supply side economics. He tries to rebuild the social safety net. He tries to really work with foreign countries. He really tries to put in place an older pre-1980 version of the American government. Well, the first thing Trump does, of course, is to overturn everything that Biden had done. But one of the interesting things about that was his attacks on the public sector and on the policies that Americans have grown to expect has woken a lot of people up. I remember for years talking about the idea that the Republicans were trying to get rid um, or trying to privatize Social Security and make cuts to Medicaid and Medicare. And I cannot count how many times people said, "You are fear mongering. That's not what they want to do. They're never going to do it." And of course, I would say, but look, the bills they're introducing. Look at they're only backing off because the Democrats are fighting so hard or whatever. And the people were like, "Now you're just fear mongering." And you can remember in the 2024 election when Kamala Harris said things like that, the news media said, "Here we go, we're fear mongering again." Well, what Trump and especially Russell Vought of the Office of Management and Budget, who is busily putting Project 2025 into place, but also Elon Musk when he was at the Department of Government Efficiency, and certainly Stephen Miller, who is a white nationalist, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. What they have done is that they have stripped the veneer off that rhetoric, and a lot of people who had a lot to say about the people they thought should not be getting government aid have suddenly discovered that the people who were getting government aid was them. So, the cutting of the U.S. aid hammered American farmers, and the tariffs have really destroyed the American soybean markets. And the cuts to Medicaid haven't even kicked in yet, but the cuts to the premium tax credits that underpin the Affordable Care Act premiums for a certain range of people. Those things are really, really, really biting. At the same time that if inflation's going up, I mean, Trump can say all he wants that it's not, but it is. I mean, I just don't even need to belabor that any longer. You've all been to the grocery store, things are more expensive. And inflation was coming down. It was almost back to the point that the Fed wanted it at the end of Biden's term, and now it's going back up again. So Americans are really getting squeezed at the same time that we're watching, the Great Gatsby party, and we're watching, the crypto scams, and we're watching the deals that the Trump administration is self-dealing, and people are suddenly it seems to me, or maybe not so suddenly, recognizing that that rhetoric has been extraordinarily self-serving for a very small group of Americans. And what that means politically then is that a lot of people are putting pressure not just on the Republican Party but also on the Democratic Party. And one of the things, I did an interview with somebody and they said, the Democrats really won in November, the beginning of November. And my answer was, I don't think it was the Democrats. I think it was the American people. Because what we're seeing, I think, is a great broadening of the American electorate. That is, of people who suddenly are waking up and saying, I need to pay attention to this. I'm going to lose my job, or I'm going to lose my health care. And when the vast majority of those people who did not vote in 2024, for example, or who thought that they were just voting for a political party like they were voting for a sports team, or who liked the way Trump sounded because they didn't really know what these policies meant, they're now paying attention and they're not liking what they're seeing. And when that has happened before in the 1850s and in the 1890s and again in the late 1920s, you see a major realignment of the country. And so when I look at the Republicans right now, I'm not just looking at the Republicans, I'm also looking at the Democrats, because the Democrats are changing too. And they're both changing to more accurately reflect the American people, because the American people are finally speaking up again. And they haven't been for a long time. And you're starting to see more and more people taking a stand in public about what they think the government should do. And this is fascinating. So I did an interview recently with Jim Himes, a representative from Connecticut. And one of his big things is that we really need to reinforce the War Powers Act so that Trump can't do whatever he wants. But he also went on to say, listen, what Trump is doing, attacking civilians, is completely off the charts. But then he said, but I wasn't real keen on Clinton and Obama attacking military targets in a similar sort of way, and they did end up deferring to Congress, but they went off on their own. And what he said about that was really interesting. He's a Democrat. He said Congress has got to stand up again for its constitutional duties and powers. And yeah, you know, so you're seeing a lot of sort of things added to the mix, and people wanting to stand up and represent the American people. And what will come out of that, I don't think we know what the parties will look like, but I will tell you, the fact that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and other Republicans are backing away suggests that there's a real problem in the Republican Party, and and we know that because MAGA has increasingly moved toward the neo-Nazis, not neo-Nazis, toward the Nazis, right? They're moving that direction. They're moving toward really the embrace of the extremists who are openly racist and sexist and anti-Semitic, and openly admire Adolf Hitler. And as they do that, they're losing supporters. That's Americans don't like Nazis in general, and that is very problematic for them. But then there is also the fact that Americans really don't like this whole Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Curtis Yarvin, those tech bro, that tech bro oligarchy, if you will, broligarchy, I guess people are calling it, that pretty openly says that they think they should rule everything. And a lot of you asked about Rockbridge, which actually, if you're interested, I wrote about it more than a week ago, I think. It's a group of very wealthy investors, I said, but I meant to say donors, but investors works too, who credit themselves with putting JD Vance into the vice presidency because they really believe, as their leader says, that the United States should have an aristocracy. And the reason I wrote about it the other night was because, I guess it was last weekend, was because you could superimpose that language directly on the 1920s, the era of the robber barons in the 1890s, and in the period of the elite Southern enslavers in the 1850s. The idea that they really should run everything. And they, in both periods, the exact same language. So, as this happens, you're going to see a lot of political changes. Now, one of the things that people always ask about is, what about a third party? And third parties are hard in the United States now for many reasons, not least because the infrastructure for a country that has as many people in it as we do is difficult to rebuild. I'm not saying it's impossible. Certainly on the Republican side, Trump has so corrupted their infrastructure that maybe it would be better to start from scratch again. But what more typically happens in the United States since the 1850s is the political parties keep the same name, but they rebrand themselves pretty dramatically. And we saw that in the 1890s when the Republican Party goes from being the robber barons to being progressive. They still called themselves the Republicans, but they were really very different generationally. And you see the same thing repeatedly with the Democrats as well. The Democrats rebrand in the same time in that period as well. So more typically, you've got the parties changing who they are really dramatically and keeping the name. And I think you can see that happening in certainly on the Democratic side now. It's really quite interesting to see. Now, somebody asked, now I'm remembering one of the other things that I left on that notebook page. Somebody asked, why do those super rich people think that they should control the rest of us? And I don't know the answer to that, obviously, but I will tell you that there's something I observed in the late 1890s, and that's that coming out of the Civil War, the Southern enslavers who had run the American South before the war, I keep calling them the elite Southern enslavers because, in fact, most white American Southerners who held their neighbors in bondage held one person, maybe two, worked in the fields alongside them. And that's the majority by far of enslavement. But a few enslavers, and that's why I say elite Southern enslavers, had huge gangs of people that they enslaved, and they were the ones who were really running everything. So, so after the war, what you see is those big names, the people, the Wade Hamptons, and the really big enslavers, the ones who had run politics before the war. They turn against the idea of black rights in 1871. I've talked about this a lot. Um, and instead of talking about race any longer, which is still uppermost in their minds, make no mistake, these are the same people, but their language changes really quickly after the establishment of the Department of Justice in 1870, because the Department of Justice starts to arrest and try and convict KKK members who attack their black neighbors based on race. That's in 1870. So in 1871, these elite Southern enslavers say, hey, we have no problem at all with race. Just, again, there's a really dramatic break in the way they talk about things. What we don't want is we don't want poor people to vote, because they will vote for roads and schools and hospitals that can only be paid for through tax dollars, and we're the only ones who own any property. So this is a redistribution of wealth. It is a form of socialism. And they talk that way in 1870, and then it takes off again in 1874. But when they talk about Black American men primarily, because of course women aren't voting, they talk about them and they denigrate them as being uneducated and poor, and coming out of enslavement when it was illegal for them to have educations. That's not a far stretch initially to say that they're uneducated. They talk about things that way, and they talk about the idea of making sure that politics is not corrupted. And that means like that doesn't mean suitcases of money in that period so much as it means corrupting the body politic like a disease. And they talk about politics that way, and they say things like that about black voters, black male voters. But it's pretty clearly rhetoric for them. That is, they can't talk about race, so they're talking about they've got this political construct. But what's really interesting is in the 1880s, when their sons come of age, they actually believe it. They actually, this is the world they've grown up in. They believe that Black Americans, men, I'm sorry, I should keep saying that, should never vote, and that they are dangerous to society. And they really believe it. And you see the lynching, which has really fallen off in the 1880s, goes off the charts in 1889 when Republicans talk about protecting Black voting again. And that's when you start to see the lynching parties and so on. And the reason I'm laying all this out is you asked why people seem to want more. And what I felt like I saw between one generation and the other in the American South in that period, among this group of elite white men, was the political rhetoric of one generation is internalized by the next generation. They really believe they're better than the people around them. And the reason I lay that out is because when you think about some of the people like, and I'm going to pick on Don Jr. here, Donald Trump Jr., when he talks about teachers, for example, which is how he got a burr under my saddle, and he talks about, he really denigrates people as if he's so much better than them. And to me, that's the face of somebody who has never had to work a day in their lives, that somehow they have decided they're better than the rest of us because that's what the world they grew up in. And at the times when he would really denigrate teachers, I used to just sit there and say, give that man 4 hours in a fourth grade classroom, because he has no concept of what real work is, and that there's just that going on. So that's maybe a little bit of a rabbit hole, but you did ask me why they feel that way, and I wonder if it's a generational change, because they have internalized what was political rhetoric in the 1980s is now their reality, even though it is utterly divorced, or their fantasy, even though it is utterly divorced from actual reality. And I think you can see this. I'm going to go back to the party crumbling for a second, in just how bad this Department of Justice is. Could they have screwed up the Comey case any more than they did? And, speaking of which, when they talk about, they have this justification for these military strikes on the people driving the boats in Venezuela. It's like, if you couldn't even manage an indictment here in the US, why should we believe anything you have to say about Venezuela? And you look at all the many ways in which they're extraordinarily incompetent, and you recognize that their own vision of how competent they are is in really serious contention with just how bad they are at the work that they're doing. All right, so the other piece I think that you can see, the Republicans in real trouble, is in the fact that the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans are fighting. The fact that the House Republicans are enormously frustrated with Mike Johnson, who seems to be losing power by the day. But one of the other things that is, to me, is really interesting was this whole thing over the weekend with and into last week with this 28-point plan, theoretically, for peace between Russia and Ukraine. And it's very clear that people were freelancing, that you had on the one side, you had Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who was apparently not aware that Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, apparently with the help of Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and the support of J.D. Vance, were freelancing to essentially give the Russians whatever they wanted. And Marco Rubio tried to stand against it, and he talked to the senators, and it went back and forth and back and forth. And it was, first of all, it was incredibly embarrassing. It was clear that that foreign policy was whichever group thought it was that day. But you asked about this today, and I think this is an important sign. News broke today, I believe it was in Bloomberg, but has been picked up elsewhere now, that Steve Witkoff apparently advised the Russians on how to approach Trump, and there has been a leaked telephone recording. Now, that whole story itself is bad enough, but someone leaked it. Always look and see when there are leaks, because that says somebody's unhappy and they're going to the media about it. and that was a pretty important leak. So that's another sign that the Republican Party, the wheels seem to be coming off the bus. That being said, that does not mean it's not going to be a mess going forward. It's probably going to be worse than ever going forward. But that does raise the question, and now I'm killing myself because I had a great ending over at the house. Sorry about that. That it does raise the question. Somebody said, "How on earth are we going to make it through 3 years of this? 3 more years of this? How? What do we see as getting Trump out of office?" And the answer is, well, first of all, we don't know. Again, that's the future. But second of all, the thing that has made the difference in the last year since January in the United States of America is us. It is the American people putting pressure on their elected officers to say, we don't like what's going on. We want to have navigational buoys. We want to have affordable health care. We want to have all of these many things that we thought were written into our laws and wouldn't be changed. And we are now discovering that the MAGA Republicans are stripping them away from us and we want them back. And that pressure, the marches, the organization, the raising money, the running for office, especially at the local level with school boards, for example, and town halls. That is what is taking somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene and having her look around and say, if I want to get reelected, my bet shouldn't be on MAGA. It should be on the issues that ordinary Americans care about. And again, if you look at those, we are overwhelmingly in favor of FEMA. We like FEMA. We like USAID. We like education. We like clean water. We like clean air. We don't like unregulated AI. All the positions that people are now calling progressive, I find fascinating because if that's the case, then we are an extraordinarily progressive country because 70 to 80% of us, 85% on some of these things, want those issues. And so if I keep saying, if we stop thinking about the world as us versus them, like Trump wants us to, or even as Republicans versus Democrats, as the political punditry seems to be doing, and think of ourselves as Americans versus a very small group of oligarchs and MAGA who are trying to force us to live in sort of this hellscape. If we think about it that way, our political alliances change in a hurry. You know, we bleed off the MAGAs who are the neo-Nazis, and we bleed off the Peter Thiels and the Broligarchs, and then we have the rest of us to enforce what we want through a democracy. That's what we've done. That's what we did in the 1850s, we did in the 1890s, did in the 1930s. It certainly looks like that's what we're doing now. Now, that being said, don't think for a minute it's going to be easy. The people who are in power are not going to give up that power easily. And they're going to get worse the more they think that their power is in jeopardy. And you can see that around us now with the attacks on Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona, for the idea that he needs to be court-martialed for making a video that actually calls for members in the service members to remember that it is the law for them to disobey unlawful orders. And somehow the Trump administration has turned that around to say that by suggesting, I actually spent hours on this yesterday, so I finally figured out how it works. They are saying, and by the way, the video that they produced, I think it was last Tuesday, is very clear. You must not obey unlawful orders. They say that. But what the administration has turned that into is, by saying that, they are saying that Trump has given unlawful orders, which, by the way, it appears he might have in Venezuela at the least. And by saying that Trump has given unlawful orders, they are, according to the Trump administration, saying that it's very convoluted. They are saying that service members should not follow the chain of command, and therefore they are committing treason, which is completely backwards. It's completely not what they said at all. But that attempt to uh, go after a sitting senator because he exercised his right to free speech, and for that matter, his prerogatives under the speech and debate clause of the Constitution, which permits members of Congress to speak freely about legislative issues, not about everything, but about legislative issues anywhere. Um, is a sign, I think, of this increasing desperation and the increasing desire to hurt people and to try and gather as much power into their hands as they possibly can. So it's not going to be easy, but the momentum is very much on the side of those of us who are trying to defend our democracy. And once again, that is not a partisan position. You can be part of this movement if you're an independent, if you're a Republican. Right now, though, the people who are really embracing democracy and trying to protect our country are the Democrats. And that's where my weight is right now, behind them, because they're the ones who are out there in front doing these, trying to protect the country. So we're in a funny time. And, I wake up every morning and say to my husband, I just feel like we're reliving the 1890s. And if you remember the 1890s, they were not calm times, but many of the signs that we see around us look very much like that. And the key going forward is to keep that pressure up, keep swinging, keep staying in the game, because we need to keep that momentum up and going.